Winter on the frontier didn't ease its way in. It didn't give warnings. It didn't care how hard you worked or how long you'd lived there. It judged you. In the early 1800s, when men pushed into the mountain country and built cabins by hand, winter had a simple way of sorting people. Not by strength, not by bravery, but by preparation. When the cold came, a cabin was either warm or it wasn't. A fire either burned clean or filled the room with smoke. A family either slept through the night or woke shivering every hour. There was no middle ground. Most people believed winter was about the cold. That was the mistake. The cold was only the final test. The real decisions were made weeks earlier in the rain and mud of autumn, when no one felt desperate yet. That's when firewood either stayed dry or slowly absorbed water day after day. That's when stacks of logs quietly pulled moisture from the ground. That's when people assumed they had enough wood without asking the only question that mattered. Will it actually burn when we need it? On the frontier, firewood wasn't a comfort. It was infrastructure. It cooked food. It dried clothes. It kept illness from taking hold. It kept children alive. Wet firewood didn't just fail to heat a cabin. It poisoned it. It produced smoke instead of warmth. It weakened draft. It forced people to keep stoves open longer, breathing air that burned the lungs and eyes. Over time, it made people sick. Men responded the way they always had. They cut more wood. They worked harder. They accepted discomfort as part of life. Very few stopped to question whether the system itself was flawed, and almost no one asked whether the problem wasn't the winter at all, but the way they were letting winter touch the things that mattered most. This story isn't about a clever invention. It's about one man who noticed something everyone else ignored. He didn't fight winter head-on. He didn't build bigger fires. He didn't waste energy trying to overpower the cold. He changed one small detail, and when winter finally arrived in full force, that detail made the difference between barely surviving and living through the season with warmth, sleep, and strength left over. The man at the center of this story was not famous. He wasn't educated in any formal sense. He didn't give speeches, and he didn't offer advice unless someone asked. He made his living the hard way. Like many mountain men and frontier workers, he spent most of his time alone. He walked timber. He scouted land. He measured trees by eye and judged weather by how it moved through the pines. His work trained him to notice small things, things most people walked past without thinking. He lived with his wife and children in a small cabin he had built himself. The walls were thick logs chinked with mud and moss. The windows were small. The hearth sat on the north wall where it could fight the worst of the winter wind. It wasn't a comfortable place by modern standards, but when the fire burned right, it was enough. That was the key difference between him and most of his neighbors. When something didn't work, he didn't complain about it first. He watched it. When the fire smoked, he didn't curse the stove. When the cabin stayed cold, he didn't blame fate. When his wood wouldn't burn, he didn't immediately reach for his axe. He paid attention. He noticed that some days the fire burned better, even with the same wood. He noticed that wood brought in during a dry spell behaved differently than wood carried in after rain. He noticed how much effort went into feeding a fire that refused to cooperate. Most men accepted these things as normal. Life was hard. Winter was harder. That was just the way it was. But this man had spent years watching forests survive weather that killed people. Trees didn't fight the wind. They adapted to it. They leaned. They shed snow. They let water run instead of collecting it. He carried that mindset home. He wasn't trying to be clever. He wasn't trying to improve anyone's life but his own family's. His goal was simple, fewer trips to the woodpile, cleaner fires, and a cabin that stayed warm through the night. That kind of thinking didn't look impressive from the outside. It didn't produce big gestures or bold declarations. It produced quiet adjustments. And on the frontier, quiet adjustments were often the ones that mattered most. Because winter doesn't punish ignorance, it punishes assumptions. And this man had learned the hard way not to assume anything without watching it fail first. The trouble didn't start in winter. It started weeks earlier in a season most people underestimated. Autumn that year was wet. Not dramatic storms, not floods, just steady rain that refused to leave. Day after day of damp air, gray skies, and ground that never fully dried. That kind of weather is worse than a hard freeze. Rain soaked into everything. The yard turned to mud. Boots stayed wet. And firewood stacked with good intentions. In spring began quietly taking on water from every direction. Most men thought covering the top was enough. A simple roof, a tarp, something to keep rain off. But rain doesn't fall straight down. It moves with wind. It blows sideways. It creeps under edges. It settles where air doesn't move. Wood stacked close to the ground pulled moisture up from below. Logs pressed tight together trapped damp air between them. After weeks of this, the damage was done. When a log looked dry on the outside, it often wasn't. Split it open and water showed itself immediately. The surface might dry for a few hours, but the inside stayed soaked. That's the worst kind of wood. It fools you. People carried it inside thinking it would burn once it warmed up. Instead, it hissed and steamed. It smothered kindling. It killed draft. Fires that should have lasted hours died in minutes. Cabins filled with smoke instead of heat. The man in this story saw it happening everywhere. Neighbors complained about the cold, about the stove, about bad luck, about the long winter ahead. But the real problem was already locked in. The wet season and the cold season had overlapped. The wood didn't get a dry window before freezing temperatures arrived. Once that happened, the moisture inside the logs froze in place. Frozen wet wood is nearly useless. You bring it inside, the ice melts, and the wood gets wet all over again. You can't win. You're either burning ice or burning steam. Most people responded the same way. They cut more wood. They worked longer days. They told themselves this was normal frontier hardship. But this man understood something important. Hardship caused by nature is unavoidable. Hardship caused by bad systems is optional. The rain had exposed a weakness everyone shared, and winter was about to press on it hard. That's when he stopped thinking about firewood as fuel and started thinking about it as something that needed protection long before it ever reached the stove. Most people think bad firewood just means a weak fire. That's not true. Wet firewood causes problems that don't stop at the stove. It affects the air you breathe, the way heat moves through a cabin, and how much energy a family has left at the end of the day. When wet wood goes into a firebox, it doesn't burn right away. First, the water inside the wood has to boil off. That takes heat, a lot of it. Heat that should be warming the room is instead wasted turning water into steam. That steam cools the fire cools the draft. The draft weakens the chimney. When draft drops, smoke has nowhere to go. That's when cabins fill with thick, white smoke. Not the kind that rises and clears, but the kind that hangs low and burns your eyes. People open stove doors longer trying to coax the fire. That only makes things worse. Breathing that air night after night takes a toll. Coughs become normal. Eyes stay irritated. Sleep is broken because the fire won't hold. For children and older adults, this isn't just uncomfortable. It's dangerous. Cold air and smoke weaken the lungs. Illness sets in faster and lasts longer. On the frontier, where doctors were far away, a simple cough could become something much worse. Wet wood also changes how people live their days. Fires fed with damp fuel need constant attention. Instead of loading the stove and resting, someone has to wake every hour to rebuild the fire. That means less sleep, less strength, less patience. Men start their mornings already exhausted. Women manage cold cabins while trying to cook clean and keep children warm. Everyone runs behind before the day even begins. The man in this story saw that pattern forming in his own home. He noticed how often the fire needed tending. He noticed how much smoke lingered in the room. He noticed how tired everyone looked by evening. This wasn't about being tough. It wasn't about enduring hardship. It was about efficiency. Dry wood burns hotter, cleaner, and longer. That means fewer trips outside, fewer interruptions at night, and a cabin that stays warm without constant effort. Wet wood does the opposite. It drains time, energy, and health. Once he understood that, the problem became clear. The issue wasn't how much wood he had. It was how much usable heat he could get from it. And that realization pushed him toward a question most people never asked. Not, how do I burn this wood? But why am I letting it stay wet in the first place? Everyone in the settlement used the same methods. They weren't careless. They were doing what they'd been taught. The most common solution was the three-sided woodshed, a roof on top, open on one side. The idea was simple: keep rain off the stack and let air move through. In theory, it made sense. In practice, it failed in wet, windy country. Rain doesn't fall straight down. Wind drives it sideways. Snow blows under roofs and piles against the back wall. Once it melts, it soaks the wood and freezes again. The open side that was supposed to help with airflow became an entry point for weather. Logs closest to the opening stayed wet all season. Logs stacked against cold ground pulled moisture from below and never dried at all. Some people tried tarps. They covered the top of the pile and weighed the edges down with rocks. At first it looked better, but tarps trap moisture. Water runs underneath and stays there. Without airflow, the wood sweats. Mold forms. Rot follows. Others built larger sheds thinking more lumber would fix the problem. Thicker walls, bigger roofs, more effort. But bigger didn't mean better. It often meant less airflow and more trapped moisture. When those methods failed, the final solution was always the same: cut more wood. Men told themselves that if half of it burned poorly, they just needed twice as much. They worked longer days. They wore down their bodies. They accepted exhaustion as the cost of survival. That approach had limits. Axes only swing so many times in cold weather. Muscles weaken. Injuries happen. Time spent cutting more wood was time not spent repairing cabins, hunting, or resting. And no amount of extra wood fixed the core issue. Wet wood still burned poorly. Smoke still filled cabins. Fires still died early. The man in this story saw all of this around him. He saw good carpenters with cold homes. He saw hard-working families struggling despite full wood piles. He saw effort being wasted because the system itself was wrong. That's when it became clear. The problem wasn't effort. The problem wasn't toughness. The problem was exposure. Wood left open to weather in a wet autumn would never recover before winter. Once frozen, it stayed compromised all season. Everyone else tried to fight winter with force. He decided to fight it with control. And that shift away from tradition and toward observation set the stage for the idea that everyone else would soon laugh at. Most people attacked the problem from the wrong end. They asked how to burn wet wood better. They asked how to build hotter fires. They asked how to endure the cold with less comfort. He asked something simpler. Why was the wood staying wet in the first place? That question changed everything. He started paying attention to how water moved through his yard. Not in theory, but in real time. He watched rain hit the roof and run down the walls. He watched snow drift against the north side of the cabin and melt slowly in the shade. He noticed how the ground stayed damp long after the rain stopped. He noticed something else too. Every trip to the woodpile made the problem worse. He'd walk 20 feet through rain or snow, shoulders hunched, carrying an armload of wood. By the time he reached the door, water had already soaked into the logs. Whatever drying had happened was undone in seconds. Even when the rain stopped, the damage continued. Wet boots tracked moisture inside. Damp wood stacked near the hearth released steam back into the room. The cycle fed itself. That's when the problem became clear. The wood wasn't just getting wet while it was stored. It was getting wet during transport. It was getting wet during use. Winter wasn't just attacking the firewood. Daily routines were helping it. He didn't need a stronger stove. He didn't need more wood. He didn't need to work harder. He needed control over exposure. The idea didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces over several days while walking back and forth between the cabin and the pile. 20 feet isn't far unless it's freezing rain and you're making that walk 10 times a day. What if he could move wood without getting it wet? What if rain never touched it at all once it left the stack? What if the wood could stay protected from the moment it was split until the moment it hit the fire? That was the real question. He wasn't thinking about buildings. He wasn't thinking about carpentry rules. He wasn't thinking about how things were supposed to look. He was thinking about one narrow function: keep water off the wood while letting air do its job. That kind of thinking often looks strange to other people. It doesn't fit familiar shapes. It doesn't follow accepted patterns. But on the frontier, unfamiliar solutions were often the only ones that worked. Once he framed the problem that way, the answer didn't require new materials. It only required using what he already had differently. And that decision led directly to the structure that would soon become the most talked about thing in the settlement. He didn't announce what he was doing. He didn't ask for opinions. He just started building. What he used wasn't impressive. Old canvas from a damaged tent, fence posts that had already seen better years, a few saplings cut from the edge of the timberline, rope, stones from the creek. Nothing new, nothing expensive. He set 2 rough lines of posts between the cabin door and the woodpile, close enough to walk through with an armload of wood, narrow enough that whatever covered it would slope instead of sag. Then he stretched the canvas over the top. It wasn't tight like a roof. It draped. It sloped downward from the cabin toward the woodpile. The sides hung low, almost to the ground, but not sealed. Air could still move underneath. From the outside, it looked wrong, like a tent that had fallen over, like something unfinished, like a waste of good canvas. That's what people saw when they walked past. They didn't see airflow. They didn't see gravity doing its work. They didn't see moisture being blocked and carried away. They saw something unfamiliar, and that was enough. Comments came quickly. Someone said it would trap moisture and rot the wood. Someone else said the first strong wind would tear it apart. A few laughed and called it lazy. Why not just walk in the rain like everyone else? Even people who meant well shook their heads. He didn't argue. He kept working. He anchored the edges with stones so the canvas wouldn't flap itself to pieces. He secured the high end near the cabin so water wouldn't pour down the wall. He left the far end open facing the woodpile. 2 days later, it was finished. Ugly, improvised, unimpressive, and immediately useful. The first time he walked through it during a rain, his shoulders stayed dry. The wood stayed dry. The path stayed usable even when the yard turned to mud. That alone felt like a small victory, but the laughter continued. People passed by and joked about it. Some called it a tunnel. Others called it a mistake. A few warned him he'd regret it once winter really arrived. He listened. He nodded. And then he went back to his work. Because on the frontier, you didn't need approval. You needed results. And winter was about to decide whether this strange wall of canvas was foolish or exactly what it needed to be. He didn't set out to invent anything. He didn't use technical terms. He didn't think in diagrams. But what he built worked because it followed basic rules of how heat, air, and moisture behave. The first rule was simple block precipitation. Rain and snow were the enemy. Once water touched the wood, the damage began. The canvas stopped that. Not perfectly, but well enough. Water hit the slope and ran off instead of soaking through. The second rule mattered even more: never trap air. That's where most people failed. Tarps and tight sheds kept water out, but they also sealed moisture in. Wet air sat still. Wood stayed damp. His structure didn't do that. The sides of the canvas hung low, but they didn't seal to the ground. The far end stayed open. Wind could move through the space freely. Not fast gusts, steady movement. That moving air carried moisture away. The third rule was one he hadn't fully planned, but benefited from immediately: temperature difference. The covered passage ran along the side of the cabin that saw the most daylight. Even in winter, that mattered. A few hours of weak sun warmed the canvas just enough to raise the air temperature inside the passage, slightly above the outside air. It wasn't much, 5 degrees, maybe 10 on a good day. But drying doesn't require heat. It requires air that's warmer than the wood. There was another source of warmth, too. Heat leaked from the cabin itself. Not enough to feel, but enough to change conditions. Warmth drifted through the wall and into the covered space. That gentle difference created natural airflow: warm air rising, cooler air pulling in behind it. Without realizing it, he'd created a drying corridor. Not a kiln, not a stove, a microclimate. This wasn't new science. Farmers had used similar ideas for centuries. Smokehouses dried meat without cooking it. Hay barns were built to shed rain while letting air circulate. Covered bridges protected wood by keeping it dry, not by sealing it tight. His structure followed the same logic. Protect from water, keep air moving, let heat do its quiet work. When he pulled wood from under the canvas after a few days, he noticed the difference immediately. The surface felt dry. Split ends lightened in color. The weight dropped. And when that wood went into the stove, it burned clean. No steam, no smoke, just steady heat. The thing everyone laughed at wasn't foolish at all. It was doing exactly what good design has always done, working with nature instead of fighting it. The real test didn't come with the first frost. It came later, late enough that mistakes were already locked in. When winter finally arrived in full, it did what winter always does on the frontier: it removed options. Temperatures dropped hard and fast. Winds came down out of the north and didn't let up. Snow followed, then more snow, then cold that stayed. This wasn't uncomfortable weather, this was survival weather. Wood piles across the settlement disappeared under drifts. Men shoveled just to reach their stacks. When they did, they found logs frozen together, locked in ice. Axes bounced. Splitting became work instead of rhythm. Worse, the wood had frozen wet. Bringing it inside didn't help. The ice melted. Water soaked deeper into the grain. Fires hissed and failed. Smoke filled rooms already struggling to stay warm. Cabins that had barely been livable in October became dangerous by December. People started burning through their reserves at alarming speed. What should have lasted weeks vanished in days. Fires that once held for hours now died in 40 minutes. Sleep disappeared. Someone always had to wake and rebuild the fire. Nights were broken into cold intervals. Mornings began exhausted. Families huddled closer to stoves that refused to cooperate. Meanwhile, under the canvas, the wood stayed dry. Snow slid off the sloped surface instead of piling up. Wind moved through the open end and under the edges. The ground beneath stayed firm instead of turning into a frozen sponge. When he walked through the covered passage, nothing changed. His shoulders stayed dry. The wood stayed light. The routine stayed efficient. That difference mattered. His fires burned longer. His cabin warmed faster. Smoke cleared instead of lingering. He didn't need to open the stove constantly. He didn't need to restart fires every hour. And people noticed. At first, they noticed quietly. A neighbor asking for a bit of kindling. A man lingering longer than usual near the structure pretending to look at something else. Then the questions came. How's your wood holding up? You staying warm? What are you burning? Winter stripped away pride quickly. When the temperature dropped below zero and cabins couldn't hold heat, no one cared how strange something looked anymore. They cared whether it worked. And for the first time since autumn, the laughter stopped. Because winter doesn't care what makes sense to people. It only cares what holds up when everything else fails. Arguments stopped when people started counting. Winter has a way of forcing that. When fuel runs short and nights get longer, opinions don't matter, results do. Men began comparing notes. How much wood did it take to keep a cabin livable for one day? How long did a fire hold before it needed more fuel? How warm did the room actually get? The differences were not small. Most cabins were burning 3 to 4 armloads of wood per day and still struggling to stay above the low 50s. Fires needed attention every 40 to 50 minutes. Ash piles were heavy, full of half-burned chunks that never gave up their heat. In his cabin, the numbers looked different. He was burning closer to 2 armloads a day. His fires held for 2 to 3 hours. The cabin stayed in the mid to high 60s without constant feeding. That wasn't comfort by modern standards, but on the frontier it was a major advantage. Someone suggested weighing the wood. Dry wood weighs less. That's not theory, that's fact. When they compared logs pulled from under the cover with logs taken from open piles, the difference was obvious. The protected wood felt lighter in the hand, split cleaner, showed pale, dry grain inside. The wet wood was darker, heavier, damp at the core. Then they compared ash. Dry wood burns almost completely. It leaves fine light ash. Wet wood wastes energy boiling water instead of producing heat. It leaves behind unburned fragments and thick residue. Over the course of a week, the numbers added up. Less wood burned, more heat produced. Longer burn times, cleaner air. Measured another way, his fuel was doing nearly twice the work. That wasn't luck. It wasn't a better stove. It wasn't better wood. It was the same species, the same cuts, the same tools. The only difference was how the wood had been treated before it ever touched the fire. That realization hit hard. People who had dismissed the structure as foolish were now standing beside it, pulling logs, weighing them, splitting them open, checking for moisture. No one laughed anymore, because numbers don't care about pride. They don't care who built something or how it looks. They only show what works and what doesn't. And winter had made the verdict clear. The strange covered passage wasn't a convenience. It wasn't a shortcut. It was the most efficient fuel system in the settlement. The change didn't happen all at once. It happened quietly. First, people stopped joking. Then they started asking questions. Not polite questions, practical ones. How steep is the slope? How far from the cabin? Do you leave the sides open? What happens when the wind picks up? Those questions meant something. They meant winter had pushed people past pride. One by one, similar structures began appearing. Not exact copies, adaptations. One man used an old tarp instead of canvas. Another used cedar shakes left over from a roof repair. Someone else used birch bark layered thick the way local tribes had done for generations. The materials changed. The principles didn't. Slope to shed snow. Airflow to carry moisture away. Protection from rain and ground damp. Each version worked better than open stacks. Each version reduced wood use. Each version made nights easier. Even the most experienced builders took notice. The settlement's best carpenter didn't rush to copy the design outright, but he modified his own woodshed. He closed off windward sides, added a sloped extension, lifted his wood higher off the ground. Different shape, same logic. That mattered more than any apology. On the frontier, respect wasn't given through words. It was given through imitation. By midwinter, the idea had stopped being his. It belonged to everyone who needed it. New families arriving asked simple questions when setting up their land. Where should we keep our wood covered, dry, air moving? That became the answer. No one bothered naming the structure anymore. It didn't need a name. It was just the way people did things now. The shift went beyond construction. People slept longer. Cabins stayed warmer. Children coughed less. Woodpiles lasted longer into the season. Winter didn't feel shorter, but it felt manageable. And the man who had built the first one never claimed credit. He didn't correct people when they improved on the idea. He didn't insist on one right way. He understood something important. Good solutions don't belong to individuals. They belong to conditions. When a system works under pressure, people keep it. When it doesn't, they abandon it. That's how frontier knowledge survives. By the time snow began to melt, what started as a strange mistake had become standard practice. And winter, once again, had chosen the winners. By spring, no one talked about the structure anymore. That's how you know something worked. On the frontier, ideas didn't survive because they were clever. They survived because they made life easier when life was hardest. Once that happened, people stopped arguing about them. They just used them. The covered wood passage wasn't remembered as an invention. It was remembered as a correction to the assumption that suffering meant strength, a correction to the belief that more effort always solved problems, a correction to the habit of doing things the way they'd always been done. The real lesson wasn't about canvas or wood piles. It was about attention. The man at the center of this story didn't outwork his neighbors. He didn't spend more money. He didn't build something impressive. He watched. He noticed patterns. He respected how air, water, and heat actually behaved. And he adjusted one small thing that removed a constant drain on his family's time, health, and energy. That's frontier wisdom at its best. Not heroic, not dramatic, just effective. Modern life often hides these lessons behind technology. We insulate problems instead of understanding them. We burn more fuel instead of asking why we're losing heat. We accept inefficiency because it's familiar. But the principles haven't changed. Fuel still needs to stay dry. Air still needs to move. Heat still follows simple rules. Whether it's firewood, energy, food storage, or daily routines, the same question applies. Where is the waste coming from? On the frontier, waste meant danger. Today it means cost, stress, and dependence, different stakes, same mechanics. That old winter proved something worth remembering. You don't need perfect conditions to live well. You need systems that work under bad ones. The man never wrote a book. He never taught a class. His idea spread because it made winter survivable for people who needed it most. That's how real knowledge moves quietly through use. And long after the canvas wore out and the posts were replaced, the lesson stayed. Don't fight the season. Don't fight the material. Don't fight the physics. Work with them. Winter always tells the truth.